She came to Harlan, Montana, weighing more than any bride the ranch hands had ever seen step off a wagon. And within a week, she'd be the reason every man at that table stopped laughing behind her back. Mara Delaney didn't come for love. She came for a contract, a stove, and a kitchen nobody else could save. What happened next, nobody on that ranch was prepared for. Stay with me to the end and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon hit a rut hard enough to rattle Mara Delaney's teeth, and she gripped the sideboard without complaint, the way she'd been gripping things without complaint for most of her 31 years. Outside, Montana stretched flat and brown toward a horizon that didn't seem to care whether anyone made it there or not. Late October had stripped the cottonwoods bare along the creek beds, and the wind carried a bite that promised an early winter. The driver, a leathery man named Otis, who'd said maybe 9 words to her since picking her up in town, finally broke his silence. "Rowan Place is just up that rise," he said, not looking at her. "Caleb, don't say much. Don't let it worry you none." "I wasn't worried," Mara said. Otis glanced sideways at her then, the kind of glance she'd grown accustomed to receiving. Quick, assessing, sliding from her face down to the rest of her and back up again before he caught himself doing it. She didn't flinch. She'd stopped flinching at that particular look around the time she turned 20. "Didn't say you was," he muttered, and snapped the reins. The ranch came into view the way most things in Montana did, slowly, then all at once. A long, low house with a sagging porch, a barn that needed its roof mended before the snow came, corrals stretching out toward pasture where she could make out the dark shapes of cattle moving like a single slow animal, and men. 4 of them, she counted, gathered near the barn doors, the kind of men who stopped working the second something new rolled into view, because new things didn't happen often enough out here to ignore. She felt their eyes find the wagon before it even came to a stop. The wagon hadn't fully stopped rolling before she heard one of them say, not quietly enough, "That her?" Mara didn't wait for Otis to come around and offer a hand. She gathered her skirts, planted her boot on the wheel hub, and lowered herself to the dirt with the kind of economy of motion that came from a lifetime of doing things herself because nobody offered, and not particularly minding it anymore. She straightened, smoothed her coat, and reached back into the wagon bed for her single canvas bag, heavier than it looked, full of what amounted to her entire life folded into corners. The 4 men hadn't moved. They stood in a loose row like a jury that had already reached its verdict. The tallest of them, a sandy-haired young man with a sunburned nose and the kind of build that came from throwing hay bales since he could walk, was the one who spoke first, though he aimed it sideways at the man next to him instead of at her. "Caleb said he was getting a cook," he said. "Didn't say nothing about getting 2 of her." The man beside him, shorter, older, missing most of a front tooth, laughed the short, ugly laugh of a man who thought he was being quiet about it. He wasn't. Mara set her bag down in the dirt. She looked at the sandy-haired one directly, the way she'd learned to look at people who said things like that. Not with heat, not with shame, just with a flat, patient attention that made most men shift their weight after a few seconds. "You're Caleb's hands, I take it," she said. The sandy-haired one blinked, caught off guard that she'd spoken at all. "That's right." "Then you'll be eating what I cook," Mara said. "Might be worth thinking on that before you decide what you've got to say about me." Nobody laughed at that. The man with the missing tooth opened his mouth like he had something else ready, but whatever it was died somewhere behind his teeth when she didn't look away from him either. A door slammed somewhere behind them, and the sound seemed to break whatever had been holding them all in place. A man came down off the porch steps, and Mara understood without being told that this was Caleb Rowan, because every one of the hands straightened up the way men did around someone whose opinion mattered to their wages. He was younger than she'd pictured from the 2 letters she'd received, younger and harder, like a fence post that had been left out through one too many winters. Dark hair going gray at the temples, though he couldn't have been much past 35. A face that had decided a long time ago that smiling wasn't worth the effort it cost. He crossed the yard with the flat, unhurried walk of a man who'd never once in his life needed to rush toward anything, because everything came to him on a schedule he'd already set. He stopped a few feet from her and looked her over, but not the way the hands had. There was no smirk in it, no sliding gaze. He looked at her the way he might look at a horse he was thinking of buying, assessing something he intended to use. "Miss Delaney," he said. "Mr. Rowan. You made good time." Wagon made good time, Mara said. I just sat in it. Something flickered near his mouth that might have been the ghost of amusement, gone before it could become anything real. He turned his head slightly toward the hands without fully looking at them. Don't you all have work? He said. It wasn't a question. They scattered like birds off a fence, though the sandy-haired one took his time about it, glancing back at her twice before he disappeared into the barn. Caleb watched them go with an expression that suggested he'd noticed the staring and filed it away somewhere to deal with later, or maybe somewhere to never deal with at all. Mara couldn't tell which yet, and she didn't waste energy guessing. She'd learn him soon enough, the way she learned every kitchen and every house and every set of hard mouths she'd ever had to feed. This is the whole arrangement then, Caleb said, turning back to her. You cook. You keep the house in order. Rooms at the back, off the kitchen. Pays what we agreed in the letter. Paid quarterly. You'll have Sundays. I read the letter, Mara said. I know you did. I'm saying it again so there's no confusion later. She almost smiled at that. The bluntness of it. The way he treated the conversation like a contract being read aloud rather than two strangers meeting for the first time. Two strangers who were, by the terms of a paper signed in town 3 weeks back, now bound to each other in marriage as much as employment. There'd been no courtship, no correspondence beyond the practical. A rancher needing a wife who could also run a kitchen. A widow's cousin in town who knew a woman in Ohio looking for a fresh start and unafraid of hard work. That was the whole of it. Mara had come because Ohio had nothing left for her, and because she'd decided a long time ago that she would rather build something useful with her own two hands than wait around for someone to decide she was worth keeping. There won't be any confusion, she said. Caleb studied her a moment longer, like he was trying to decide whether that confidence was earned or just talk. Then he nodded once, short, and turned toward the house. Kitchen's through the back. I'll have someone bring your trunk if you've got more coming. This is all I've got, Mara said, lifting her bag. He glanced at it, one bag for a woman meant to run his household, and something passed behind his eyes that she couldn't read. Not pity. She wouldn't have tolerated pity. Something closer to recalculation, like a man revising a number he'd already written down. All right then, was all he said. The kitchen, when she stepped into it, told her more about Caleb Rowan than any conversation could have. It wasn't filthy in the way of neglect born from laziness. There was no rot, no vermin she could see at first glance, nothing that spoke of a man who didn't care. It was worse than that, in its own way. It was the kitchen of a place that had given up trying to be anything more than functional. Pots sat stacked unevenly with grease crusted along their rims, the kind that came from being scrubbed in a hurry by hands that had better things to do. The stove sat cold and gray, its surface pitted with burn marks. A single shelf held what passed for supplies, a near-empty flour sack, a tin of lard scraped down to its corners, dried beans in a jar gone cloudy with dust. The table in the center of the room was scarred with knife marks and ringed with the pale ghosts of 100 mugs set down too hot. This was a kitchen that fed men because men had to eat, and nothing more. Not a single thing in it suggested anyone had ever taken pleasure in a meal here, or expected to. Mara set her bag down just inside the door and stood there a long moment, taking it in the way a doctor might take in a patient, cataloging damage, deciding where to start. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find a boy, maybe 16, hovering in the doorway with an armload of firewood he clearly didn't know whether to bring in or not. "You the new cook?" he asked. "I am. What's your name?" "Tommy." He shifted the wood in his arms. "Caleb said to bring this in for the stove, but I wasn't sure if—" "Bring it in," Mara said. "Right there's fine." He did, dropping it with a clatter near the stove, then straightened and looked at her with the open, unguarded curiosity that only the very young seemed to manage anymore. "You really gonna cook for all of us? There's 6, counting Caleb." "That's the arrangement. Last cook we had quit after 2 months, said the kitchen wasn't fit for nobody to work in." Tommy said this like he was offering her useful information, not an insult, though Mara noted the way his eyes dropped briefly to her midsection before sliding back up, the same calculation the hands outside had made, only younger and less cruel in its execution. "Well," Mara said, "I'm not her." She rolled up her sleeves. She started with the stove, because nothing else mattered until the stove worked properly. She found the flue half clogged with old soot and cleared it with a metal rod she discovered hanging from a nail by the back door, coughing through the black cloud that came down on her when the blockage finally gave way. By the time she had a fire drawing properly, her hands were streaked gray to the wrist, and her good traveling dress had a scorch mark near the hem that she knew she'd never fully get out. She didn't care. Clothes were replaceable. A working stove was the difference between a kitchen that survived and one that thrived. Next came the pots, which she set to soak in water heated over that newly working fire, scraping at the worst of the grease with a knife while she waited. The flour she sifted twice to check for weevils, finding a few, discarding what she had to and salvaging what she could. The lard tin she set aside for rendering more once she had a chance to ask about hog stores. The beans she'd soak overnight. They'd cook up fine despite the dust. Nothing wrong with them that a good rinse wouldn't fix. By the time the light started going golden long through the kitchen's single west-facing window, she'd taken stock of nearly every shelf and cupboard in the place, building a mental ledger of what existed and what didn't, what needed replacing and what could be salvaged with enough scrubbing and patience. She was elbow-deep in dishwater when Caleb appeared in the doorway again, having apparently come to check on the progress of his investment. He stopped just inside the threshold and looked around, at the cleared stove, at the stacked pots drying along one wall, at the soot still smudged across her forearms. And something in his expression shifted, subtle but real, the way a man's face changes when he realizes he's misjudged the weight of something he was about to lift. "You've been at this since you got here," he said. "Kitchen wasn't going to clean itself." "Didn't expect you to start tonight." Mara dried her hands on a rag and looked at him steadily. "Mr. Rowan, I didn't come here to sit pretty and wait for instructions. You're paying me to run this kitchen. I intend to run it." He held her gaze a moment, and there was something almost like surprise in his face, quickly smoothed over the way he seemed to smooth over most things. "Supper's usually whatever's quickest. Beans, salt pork, biscuits if somebody's got the patience." "Tonight it'll be beans and salt pork," Mara agreed. "Tomorrow it'll be better than that." "You don't need to prove anything tonight." "I'm not proving anything," she said. "I'm just doing the job." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that answer away with the others, and left her to it without another word. Supper that first night was a quiet, watchful affair. The five hands, Tommy, the sandy-haired young man whose name turned out to be Wes, the gap-toothed older one called Pete, and two others named Daniel and Frank who said almost nothing the entire meal, crowded around the long table with the careful, sideways attention of men deciding whether something was safe to trust. Caleb sat at the head, eating without comment, the way he seemed to do most things. The beans were simple. Mara had doctored them as best she could with what she'd found. A bit of onion gone soft at the edges, but still usable. A hard rind of bacon fat she'd rendered down. Salt she'd measured with more care than the kitchen's previous occupant clearly ever had. It wasn't a feast. It was honest food, properly seasoned, properly cooked, served hot instead of lukewarm. It was, Mara could tell from the way conversation slowly died around the table, and was replaced by the steady scrape of spoons more than any of them had expected. Wes was the one who finally said something, though he aimed it at his plate rather than at her. "These beans is different." "They're the same beans," Mara said from where she stood near the stove, watching the pot rather than the men. "Just cooked right." Pete snorted into his coffee. "Don't know what's gotten into Caleb. Hiring a—" He stopped himself, glanced at her, and amended whatever he'd been about to say. "Hiring someone new." "You can finish that sentence, Pete," Mara said, not turning around. "I've heard worse said about me by better men than you." The table went very still. Tommy's eyes went wide. Caleb's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Mara saw something cross his face that looked almost like he was fighting back a laugh. Pete's ears went red. "Wasn't going to say nothing," he muttered. "Good," Mara said. "Eat your beans." There was a beat of silence, and then, astonishingly, Daniel, the quiet one, let out a short bark of laughter before he could stop himself, quickly smothered behind his hand. Wes grinned down at his plate. Even Frank's mouth twitched. Caleb said nothing, but he finished his beans, and when he stood to leave the table, he paused near the stove on his way out. "Beans were good," he said, low enough that it wasn't meant for the whole room. "They'll be better tomorrow," Mara said. He looked at her for a moment longer than the comment required, like he was recalculating that number again, then nodded and went out into the dark toward whatever final chores waited for him before the night closed in. Her room, when she finally retired to it, was small and spare. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out toward the corrals. She sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark for a while, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a ranch settling for the night, cattle lowing somewhere distant, the creak of the barn, wind working at the eaves. Her body ached in the particular way it did after a day of unaccustomed labor, her hands raw from lye soap and hot water, her back stiff from bending over a stove that wasn't built for someone her height. She thought about this wagon ride out, the way the hands had looked at her, the easy cruelty in Wes's first comment before he'd even learned her name. She thought about Pete's unfinished sentence, the dozen ways it could have ended, none of them anything she hadn't heard before in one form or another. In Ohio, in church pews, in the eyes of men who'd courted her sisters and never once looked twice at her, in the careful, pitying voices of women who meant well and wounded anyway. She'd made peace with all of it a long time ago, or told herself she had. Made peace wasn't quite the right phrase. She'd simply decided, somewhere in her 20s, that she would not spend her life waiting for the world's permission to take up space in it. If people wanted to underestimate her, that was their mistake to make. She'd let her hands speak for her instead. Hands were harder to argue with than faces. Caleb Rowan was an unknown quantity still. Hard, clearly. Practical to the point of bluntness. But he hadn't laughed at her, hadn't sneered, hadn't looked at her the way the others had. He'd looked at her the way he looked at his ledgers, she suspected, wanting to know what she'd produce, not what she looked like producing it. There was something almost restful in that, even if it wasn't warm. She lay back on the narrow bed, staring up at a ceiling she couldn't see in the dark, and let herself feel, for just a moment, the weight of how far Ohio was from here, how completely alone she was in a house full of strangers who hadn't decided yet whether to want her. Then she closed her eyes and told herself, the way she had every first night in every new kitchen she'd ever walked into. Tomorrow, she would cook, and the food would speak first. She woke before dawn out of habit, the sky outside her window still the deep blue-black of true night, and lay still for a moment getting her bearings before she remembered where she was. Montana, the Rowan Ranch. Her new life, such as it was, waiting just beyond the door. She dressed quickly in the cold, plaited her hair back tight and practical, and went out to the kitchen to find the fire had gone to embers overnight. She built it back up methodically, the way she'd learned as a girl in her mother's kitchen, layering kindling with the patience of someone who understood that rushed fires went out and well-built ones lasted. By the time the first gray light came through the window, she had biscuit dough resting under a cloth and a pan of salt pork rendering slow and easy, the smell of it filling the kitchen in a way that hadn't existed in this house in longer than anyone could likely remember. Tommy was the first one in, drawn by the smell before he'd even fully dressed, his shirt only half buttoned and his hair standing up at odd angles. "That smells like Sunday," he said, dropping into a chair at the table. "It's Tuesday," Mara said, not looking up from the dough she was now rolling out. "Don't matter. Smells like Sunday anyway." She allowed herself a small smile at that, the first real one since she'd arrived, and set to work cutting the biscuits into rounds. By the time the rest of the men filed in, Wes rubbing sleep from his eyes, Pete moving slower than the others with the stiff gait of a man whose joints didn't love the cold mornings, Daniel and Frank trailing behind in their usual silence. The table held something none of them had clearly expected. Biscuits split and steaming, salt pork crisped properly instead of left gray and chewy, a pot of coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of brown water with ambitions. Caleb came in last, as he had the night before, and stopped just inside the doorway the same way he had the previous evening, taking in the kitchen with an expression Mara was beginning to learn. Assessment, recalculation, the quiet math of a man revising his expectations upward without wanting to show it too plainly. "You didn't sleep in," he said. "Didn't intend to," Mara said. "Sit down, Mr. Rowan. Food's getting cold." He sat. He ate. And though he said nothing more about it directly, Mara noticed he took a second biscuit before the basket made its way fully around the table, and noticed too the way his shoulders sat a little less rigid than they had the evening before, as though something in him had decided, cautiously, that this arrangement might not be the gamble he'd half expected it to be. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Mara built with her own two hands, brick by brick, the same way she'd rebuilt every kitchen she'd ever walked into. She rose before the sun. She kept the stove fed and steady instead of letting it go cold between meals. She inventoried every shelf, every barrel, every sack of grain in the small root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house, and began making a list. In a notebook she'd brought from Ohio, its pages still mostly blank, of what the ranch had, what it lacked, and what she intended to change. She learned the men in pieces, the way she learned every kitchen's occupants. Tommy was easy. 16 and hungry in the way only growing boys were hungry, grateful for anything put in front of him and unguarded enough to say so. Wes carried himself like he had something to prove, quick with comments that weren't always kind but seemed to soften, day by day, the longer her cooking spoke for her. Pete was harder, set in old habits and older opinions, the kind of man who needed more than a few good meals to change his mind about anything. Daniel and Frank remained quiet, watchful, the sort of men who reserved judgment until they had reason not to, which Mara found she preferred over loud opinions either way. And Caleb. Caleb remained the hardest to read of them all. He didn't speak much, even at meals, even when she set something in front of him that clearly pleased him. She could tell by the speed at which he ate, the way his fork moved without hesitation, the way he sometimes finished before the others and sat with his coffee, watching the table with an expression she couldn't fully name. But he never offered praise the way the hands sometimes did now, grudging and surprised as it was. He simply ate and worked, and ran his ranch with the same flat efficiency he'd shown her on the first day. It was on the fourth evening, after supper had been cleared and the men had scattered to their bunks, that she found him still at the table, a ledger open in front of him, a single lamp burning low. "You're up late," Mara said, wiping down the stove. "Numbers don't do themselves," Caleb said, not looking up. She finished her work in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the scratch of his pencil and the settling creak of the house around them. Then, because the silence had stretched long enough that it felt less like privacy and more like avoidance, she spoke again. "You've hardly said 2 words to me since I got here that weren't about chores." Caleb's pencil paused. He looked up, and for a moment something flickered across his face that looked almost like discomfort, a man being asked to account for something he hadn't examined too closely himself. "Didn't think you needed conversation," he said. "Thought you needed a working kitchen and a fair wage." "I needed both," Mara said. "Doesn't mean I can't use the first along with the second." He considered that, the way he seemed to consider most things, slowly, like a man weighing the cost of a decision before committing to it. "Fair enough," he said finally. "What is it you want to know?" "Nothing in particular," Mara said. "I'm not asking for a confession, Mr. Rowan. I'm saying good evening would do, now and then. Costs you nothing." Something in his face shifted then. Not quite a smile, but close enough to its shadow that she noticed it. "Good evening, Miss Delaney," he said. "Mara," she said, "if we're going to be married in the eyes of the law and the church both, I'd rather you use my name." He held her gaze a moment, and the lamplight caught something steady and considering in his eyes. The same look he'd given her that first afternoon when he'd assessed her like a horse he was thinking of buying, except now there was something else mixed into it, something she couldn't quite name yet, but that didn't feel unkind. "Mara," he said, like he was testing the weight of it. "That's better," she said, and went back to her stove, leaving him to his ledgers and his lamp, and not minding, for the first time since she'd arrived, the quiet that settled back over the kitchen. "That's it." It was Wes who finally said something that put words to what the rest of them had clearly been thinking but hadn't dared voice. And he said it the way men like him usually said things. Too loud, in front of the wrong audience, thinking he was being clever. It happened nearly 2 weeks in, on a cold afternoon when Mara had spent the better part of the day rendering a hog carcass Caleb had slaughtered that morning, the whole kitchen thick with the smell of fat and wood smoke, her arms aching from hours of careful, methodical work. She just set a tray of cracklings to cool on the table when Wes came through the back door, stomping snow off his boots, and stopped short at the sight of her, flour-dusted, sweat damp at the temples despite the cold outside, sleeves rolled to her elbows. "Lord, Mara, you look like you've been wrestling a hog instead of cooking one," he said, grinning like he expected the others nearby to laugh along. A couple of the men did chuckle, more from habit than actual amusement, but it was Pete, coming in right behind him, who pushed it further. "Wouldn't surprise me if she could." Pete said, not quite under his breath. Woman her size. The kitchen went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when something's been said that can't easily be unsaid. Tommy, seated at the table peeling potatoes, froze with the knife halfway through a peel. Daniel and Frank, near the door, exchanged a look but said nothing. Mara didn't look up immediately. She finished setting down the tray, wiped her hands deliberately on her apron, and only then turned to face them, her expression calm in a way that somehow made the room feel more tense, not less. You know, she said, conversational, like she was discussing the weather, I've been doing this work since before you were old enough to wipe your own nose, Pete. Cooking for households twice this size, in kitchens half as good as this one's becoming. I've heard every comment you can think to make about my size, and a few you probably haven't thought of yet. Pete's grin faltered. So here's what I'll tell you, Mara continued. Same thing I'd tell any man who thinks my body's more interesting than my work. Eat what I put in front of you, or don't. But you'll do it without running your mouth about things that are none of your business. Or you can explain to Mr. Rowan why his hands are too busy commenting on the cook to get their own chores done. The silence that followed had teeth in it. Pete opened his mouth, found nothing useful to put there, and closed it again. Wes looked suddenly very interested in the floor. It was Caleb's voice from the doorway none of them had noticed him standing in that finally broke the quiet. She's right, he said, and every head in the room turned. You've got chores, Pete. Go do them. Pete's face went red, but he didn't argue. He grabbed his coat and went, Wes trailing after him with considerably less swagger than he'd walked in with. The kitchen slowly came back to life around them, Tommy resuming his potatoes, Daniel and Frank finding sudden urgent business elsewhere, until it was only Mara and Caleb left, the cracklings cooling between them on the table. You didn't need to do that, Mara said. I know, Caleb said. Did it anyway. He looked at her a moment longer, something steady and unhurried in his expression, and then he reached out, picked up one of the cracklings off the tray, and ate it without ceremony. These are good, he said. They're pig fat and salt, Mara said. Not hard to get right. A lot of things on this ranch were easy to get right, Caleb said. Nobody bothered, before you. He said it plainly, without flourish, the way he said most things, and turned to go back out into the cold. But he paused at the door, hand on the frame, and looked back at her once more. For what it's worth, he said, Pete's wrong. About all of it. Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, leaving Mara alone in a kitchen thick with wood smoke and the lingering warmth of something she hadn't expected to find out here. Not yet, not so soon, and not from a man who'd shown her nothing but flat practicality since the moment she'd stepped down off that wagon. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to, looking at the door he'd just walked through before she shook herself back into motion and returned to her work. There was supper to plan. There was a ranch to feed. And whatever this strange, unhurried thing was building quietly between her and Caleb Rowan, it would have to wait its turn behind the cracklings cooling on the table and the bread rising under its cloth by the window. Outside, the Montana wind picked up, rattling against the glass, carrying the first hard promise of the winter still to come. And inside, for the first time since she'd arrived, Mara Delaney let herself believe that she might have found, in this hard, unlovely place, somewhere she was finally meant to stay. The frost came hard that first week of November, coating the bunkhouse windows in lace patterns by morning, and Mara found herself rising in darkness thick enough that she had to light a lamp just to find her own boots. The cold didn't slow her down. If anything, it sharpened her, gave her something to push against, and she pushed. She'd taken to keeping her notebook open on the corner of the kitchen table now, instead of tucked away in her room, filling its pages with lists that grew longer by the day. Flour needed replenishing before the roads froze solid enough to make the trip to town a misery. The root cellar held potatoes and onions enough to last through January if she rationed carefully, but the apples were going soft faster than she liked, and she'd need to either preserve them quick or watch half the crop rot. The smokehouse out back hadn't been used properly in what looked like a year or more, its racks empty, its walls gone soft with disuse. She brought this up to Caleb on a morning when he lingered at the table longer than usual, nursing his coffee while the hands filed out to the cold. Your smokehouse is sitting idle, she said, setting a plate of eggs in front of him. Hadn't gotten around to it, Caleb said. Last cook didn't ask. I'm asking. If you slaughter another hog before the ground freezes solid, I can smoke half of it instead of just salting everything down. Keeps better. Tastes better too, if I'm being honest, and I generally am. Caleb looked up at her over his coffee, something almost amused in the set of his mouth. You generally are what? Honest, Mara said, especially about food. Notice that, he said, and went back to his eggs, but she caught the small nod he gave afterward, the kind of nod that meant something had been decided even if he hadn't said the words out loud. 2 days later, Daniel and Frank slaughtered a second hog, and Mara spent the better part of a week splitting her hours between the kitchen and the smokehouse, building fires low and slow, learning the particular rhythms of a building she'd never tended before through trial and a fair amount of error. The first batch came out too dry, over-smoked from a fire she'd let burn too hot overnight. She didn't waste it, ground it down, mixed it into beans, called it seasoning instead of a mistake, and nobody at the table was the wiser. The second batch came out right, and when she carried a slab of it into the kitchen and sliced off pieces for the men's supper, even Pete, who'd gone quiet and careful around her since the day in the kitchen with the cracklings, ate 3 helpings without comment. It was Tommy who finally said what the rest of them seemed to be thinking, but hadn't worked up the nerve to put into words. This is the best thing I ever ate in my whole life, he announced through a mouthful of smoked pork, which earned him a swat from Daniel and a laugh from the rest of the table, the kind of easy laughter that hadn't existed in that kitchen 2 weeks earlier. Mara, standing near the stove, allowed herself the satisfaction of it without making a show of it. She'd learned a long time ago that the trick to this kind of work wasn't announcing your victories. It was letting the proof sit on the table and speak for itself, course after course, meal after meal, until even the hardest skeptics stopped finding reasons to doubt. Chet, word of what was happening at the Rowan Ranch began to travel the way news always did in a place as sparse as Harland. Slowly at first, carried by the men who rode into town for supplies, then faster, the way gossip picked up speed once it had enough fuel to burn. It was Wes, of all people, who first let it slip in town, mentioning to the man behind the mercantile counter that the new cook out at Rowan's had the smokehouse running and the kitchen smelling like something out of a church social, which was an odd comparison for a man who rarely, if ever, attended one, but it stuck, and within a week the story had grown arms and legs of its own. By the time Caleb made his own trip into town for supplies, the mercantile owner, a stout, talkative man named Russell Hayes, greeted him with more enthusiasm than usual. Hear your new wife's turned that ranch around, Russell said, weighing out flour. Smoking hogs, baking bread, the whole business. Wes was in here going on about it like he'd never eaten before in his life. Caleb, never a man for idle talk, simply said, "She's a good cook." "That what they're calling it," Russell said, with a grin that suggested he meant more by the comment than the words themselves carried. And Caleb felt something tighten in his jaw that he didn't examine too closely, didn't have the patience or the inclination to examine, because thinking too hard about why a stranger's tone bothered him felt like opening a door he wasn't ready to walk through. "She's a good cook," he repeated, flatter this time, and paid for his order without further comment. But the comment followed him home anyway, sitting at the back of his mind through the long ride out, mixing uneasily with things he'd been noticing himself and not naming. The way the kitchen smelled different now, not just better food, but something warmer underneath it. Bread proofing under cloth, herbs drying in bundles from the rafters, where there'd been nothing before but bare wood and cobwebs. The way his hands had started coming in for supper on time instead of dragging their feet, eating fast and silent the way men used to when food was just fuel, now lingering, talking, laughing in a way that hadn't existed in this house since his mother died, and the warmth had gone out of it along with her. He hadn't asked for any of that. He'd asked for a cook. What he was getting, slowly and without his permission, was something closer to a home. It was the apples that brought things to a point. In the end, small thing, the kind of small thing that ends up mattering more than it should. Mara had been preserving what she could of the softening crop, working through a long afternoon with a paring knife, and more patience than the task probably deserved, when Caleb came through the kitchen on his way to check the cellar and stopped at the sight of her, surrounded by peels and half-filled jars, sleeves rolled up despite the cold seeping through the walls. "That's a lot of apples," he said. "Wasted otherwise," Mara said, not looking up from her knife. "Figured I'd put them up before they go soft past saving. Apple butter keeps. Pies you can make through the winter if you've got dried apples on hand. You don't have to do all that yourself." "Nobody else seems inclined to," Mara said. and there was an edge to it, faint but real. The accumulated tiredness of 2 weeks spent rebuilding a household alone, with no help beyond what Tommy occasionally offered between chores. Caleb stood there a moment watching her work, and something in him, some calculation he'd been running since the conversation with Russell Hayes, since watching his men linger over supper, since noticing the particular way she hummed under her breath when she thought no one was listening, settled into a decision. He pulled out a chair, sat down across from her, and picked up a paring knife from the pile. "Show me," he said. Mara looked up, surprised enough that her hand stilled for a moment. "You don't need to do this, Mr. Rowan." "Caleb," he corrected, "and I didn't say I needed to, said show me." She studied him a moment, like she was deciding whether this was a joke at her expense or something else entirely, and finding nothing in his face but the same flat seriousness he brought to everything, she finally nodded and reached for an apple. "Like this," she said, demonstrating the long, unbroken peel she'd been working toward all afternoon. "Don't rush it. The skin comes off easier in one piece if you're patient with the blade." Caleb's first attempt came off in 3 jagged pieces. His second wasn't much better. Mara, despite herself, laughed. A real laugh. Short and surprised out of her. The first one he'd heard from her since she'd arrived. "You're better with cattle than apples," she said. "Cattle don't require this kind of patience," Caleb said, frowning down at his mangled peel like it had personally offended him. "Cattle just need feeding and moving." "People need feeding too," Mara said. "Just takes more care getting there." He glanced up at her then, something steady in his eyes that made her stomach do something unfamiliar, something she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to admit, not since long before Ohio had become a place she needed to leave. "Suppose that's true," he said, and went back to his apple, slower this time, more careful, and didn't manage a full peel but came closer than before, and didn't complain when she took the knife from him gently to show him the angle one more time, her hand briefly over his on the handle, neither of them saying anything about how long that contact lasted before she drew back and returned to her own work. They sat there through the better part of an hour, peeling and coring in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable the way silences between them had sometimes been before, but something closer to companionship, the kind that didn't need filling. Mara told him, when he finally asked, a little about Ohio, her mother's kitchen, the brothers who'd married before her and moved on with their lives, the particular loneliness of being the daughter nobody quite knew what to do with. Caleb, in turn, offered pieces of his own history sparingly, the way a man does when he's not used to offering anything at all. His mother's death when he was 12, his father's hard hand and harder expectations, the ranch he'd built up alone after his father passed, brick by brick, the same way Mara had been rebuilding his kitchen. "Never had much reason to talk this much," Caleb admitted at one point, looking faintly bewildered by his own behavior. "Apples will do that," Mara said. "Give a man's hand something to do besides fidget, and his mouth tends to follow." He laughed at that, a real laugh, low and a little rusty, like a door that hadn't been opened in years finally swinging on its hinges. And Mara found herself smiling at the sound of it, surprised by how much she'd wanted to hear it. The good feeling of that afternoon didn't last uninterrupted, because nothing on a ranch ever did. And Pete chose that same week to make one more attempt at the kind of comment Mara had thought she'd already put to rest. It happened over supper. The apple butter she'd finished making sitting in a crock at the center of the table, spread thick over fresh bread that had the whole room quiet, with the particular reverence men reserved for good food after a hard day's work. Pete, 3 helpings in and apparently feeling generous with himself, leaned back in his chair and said, to no one in particular but loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Don't know how a woman her size stays on her feet all day. Way she eats her own cooking." The words landed wrong in a room that had just spent an hour growing warmer, and Mara felt the old familiar tightness rise in her chest, the one she'd carried since girlhood, the one that came from being reduced again and again to a body instead of a person. But before she could open her mouth to answer it herself, Caleb's fork hit the table with a sharp, deliberate click. "Pete," he said, and his voice carried none of its usual flatness now. There was something hard underneath it, something that made even Wes go still beside him. "You'll apologize to Mara, and then you'll think real careful before you open your mouth about her again." Pete's face went through several colors in quick succession, landing somewhere between embarrassed and defensive. Wasn't trying to start nothing, Caleb, just an observation. It wasn't an observation, Caleb said. It was an insult dressed up as one, and I won't have it at my table. Mara's done more for this house in 2 weeks than the last 3 cooks managed in 2 years combined, and you'll show her the respect that's earned, or you'll find work somewhere else. That clear? The table had gone utterly silent. Tommy's eyes were wide as saucers. Even Daniel and Frank, usually content to stay out of any conflict entirely, were watching with open interest. Pete swallowed hard. Clear, he muttered. He looked at Mara, something almost sheepish in his expression now that the room's full attention had turned on him. Sorry, Mara. Wasn't right what I said. Apology accepted, Mara said evenly, though there was something warm moving through her chest now that had nothing to do with the stove behind her, something she didn't dare name too quickly for fear of being wrong about it. Eat your bread before it goes cold, Pete. Be ashamed to waste good apple butter on an argument. The tension broke into something almost like laughter, the kind that came after a held breath finally released, and the table settled back into its usual easy rhythm. But Mara caught Caleb's eye across the table as the conversation resumed around them, and what passed between them in that look wasn't gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. It was something steadier than that, an acknowledgement of something that had shifted between them in the weeks since she'd stepped down off that wagon, something neither of them had named out loud yet, but both of them, she suspected, had started to feel taking root. After supper, when the men had scattered and the kitchen had gone quiet again, Caleb lingered the way he'd started to lately, ostensibly over his ledgers, but really, Mara had begun to understand, because he wanted the company. You didn't need to do that, she said, echoing the same words she'd used the day of the cracklings, though her tone carried less surprise this time and something closer to fondness. I know, Caleb said. Did it anyway. You keep saying that. Keep meaning it, he said, and there was a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth now, one she was starting to recognize as belonging only to her, reserved for moments when the rest of the world wasn't watching. Mara busied herself wiping down the table, partly to give her hands something to do, partly because the warmth building in her chest felt too large and unfamiliar to sit with directly. People are going to talk, you know, in town, about all this. Let them talk, Caleb said. Talk doesn't fill a kitchen or run a ranch. You do. She glanced at him, surprised by the plainness of it, the total absence of hesitation. That's a generous thing to say. It's a true thing to say, Caleb corrected. I don't deal much in generous. Just true. Outside, the wind picked up against the windows, carrying the particular cold that meant winter was no longer threatening but arriving, settling in to stay through the long Montana months ahead. But inside the kitchen, with the smell of wood smoke and apple butter still hanging warm in the air, and Caleb Rowan sitting across the table with his ledger forgotten and his attention entirely on her, Mara Delaney felt something she hadn't expected to find out here. In a marriage built on practicality and a contract signed in town, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, like she belonged somewhere completely, body and all, with nothing left to prove and no one left in the room who needed convincing. The smokehouse held its winter stores. The cellar held its apples and potatoes, ordered now instead of forgotten. And the kitchen, once a ruin nobody had cared enough to save, had become the warm, beating center of a household that was slowly, carefully, becoming something neither of them had quite expected when the wagon first rolled up that long, dusty drive. The first real snow came in mid-November, burying the yard under a foot of white overnight, and with it came a stretch of confinement that tested every nerve the ranch had built up over the past weeks. Cattle still needed tending regardless of weather, which meant the hands rode out into bitter cold every morning and came back half-frozen, short-tempered, hungry in a way that went beyond the stomach. Mara understood that kind of hunger. She'd seen it in Ohio during hard winters, the way cold and exhaustion wore down a person's patience until small things became large ones, until men who'd been getting along just fine started snapping at each other over nothing at all. It was Frank, of all people, the quietest of the hands, a man who rarely said more than a sentence at a stretch, who came in one evening so cold his hands shook too badly to hold his fork, and Pete, exhausted and raw himself, made some comment about Frank needing his mother to feed him, and the two of them nearly came to blows right there at the table before Caleb's voice cut through the noise and ordered them both outside to cool off, snow or no snow. Mara watched it happen with a steadily growing understanding that good food alone wasn't going to be enough to hold this household together through the winter ahead. These men needed more than full bellies. They needed something to look forward to, something that reminded them they were more than hired hands working themselves to exhaustion in service of someone else's cattle. They needed, she thought, a reason to gather at that table that went beyond simple necessity. She decided, that same night, what she was going to do about it. So, "You're planning something," Caleb said, 2 evenings later, watching her from his usual seat at the table as she moved through the kitchen with a focus he'd come to recognize as purposeful rather than routine. "I can tell." "I'm always planning something," Mara said. "Comes with the job." "This is a different kind of planning. You've got that look." She glanced at him, amused despite herself that he'd learned her expressions well enough to notice the difference. "There's a hen house out back that's been sitting half empty since I got here. I want to fix that. And I want to do something special for the men this week. Something that isn't just feeding them, but reminds them why staying out here through a Montana winter is worth the trouble." Caleb leaned back in his chair, considering her with the same careful attention he gave his ledgers. "What did you have in mind?" "A proper roasted chicken supper, done right. Not the way most folks out here do it, boiled till it's tough as boot leather and seasoned with nothing but salt. I mean slow roasted, basted, the kind of meal that makes a man remember what good food's supposed to taste like. We've got chickens," Caleb said. 8 or 9, I think. Was going to let them lay through winter. "I only need one good bird," Mara said. "And I need a few things from town I don't currently have. Proper herbs, if Russell's got them this time of year. Butter enough to baste it right. Maybe some vegetables that haven't gone soft in the cellar yet." Caleb studied her a long moment, and something in his face softened in the particular way it had started softening around her these past weeks. A slow thaw she'd watched happen the same way she'd watched the kitchen itself transform from ruin into order. "I'll ride into town tomorrow," he said. "Get what you need." "You don't have to do that yourself. Send Tommy." "I want to do it myself," Caleb said simply, and something in the way he said it made Mara's chest go warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove beside her. He came back the next afternoon with everything she'd asked for, and more besides. A small sack of dried herbs Russell had kept tucked away for his own family's use, a crock of fresh butter from the dairy 2 farms over, a paper twist of cinnamon and sugar that Mara hadn't even thought to request, but that made her laugh out loud when she found it tucked at the bottom of the supply sack. "What's this for?" she asked, holding it up. Caleb shrugged, looking faintly embarrassed by his own gesture, the way a man looks when he's done something kind without quite knowing how to acknowledge it himself. "Russell said women like a little something sweet besides the main business. Didn't know if that was true, but figured it couldn't hurt to ask." "It's true," Mara said, softer than she meant to. "Thank you, Caleb." He nodded once, gruff, and busied himself unloading the rest of the wagon. But she caught him glancing back at her twice on his way to the barn, and she found herself smiling down at the cinnamon for longer than the moment probably warranted. She spent the better part of the following day preparing for the supper, working with a patience that bordered on ceremony. She selected the bird herself from the small flock out back, choosing one of the older hens that had stopped laying reliably, the kind of practical decision that still managed to feel significant in its own small way. She dressed it carefully, rubbed it down with butter and the herbs Russell had set aside, stuffed its cavity with onion and a little of the dried sage she'd found growing wild along the creek bed back in October and saved for exactly this purpose. The roasting itself took hours, low and slow, the way she'd learned from her mother and refined over years of cooking for households that couldn't afford to waste good meat through careless preparation. She basted it every 20 minutes, the kitchen filling slowly with a smell that drew Tommy in from his chores twice just to stand in the doorway and breathe it in, grinning like a boy who'd stumbled onto something better than Christmas. "That smells like something out of a dream," he said the second time. And Mara, sweat damp despite the cold outside, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "Patience, Tommy. Good things take their time." By the time the men filed in for supper that evening, stomping snow off their boots and rubbing their hands together against the cold, the table was set in a way it had never been set before. Not fancy exactly, nothing the ranch couldn't afford or sustain, but careful, deliberate. A cloth Mara had found folded at the bottom of a trunk and pressed flat for the occasion, the chicken sitting golden and glistening at the center, surrounded by roasted vegetables and a basket of bread still warm from the oven. The men stopped just inside the doorway, all five of them, staring at the table the way men stare at something they don't quite believe is meant for them. That for us? Wes asked, sounding genuinely uncertain. Who else would it be for? Mara said. Sit down before it goes cold. They sat, slow and almost reverent, the kind of careful movement men make when they sense they're in the presence of something they don't want to disturb. Caleb came in last, as always, and stopped in the doorway the way he always did. But this time his expression held something Mara hadn't seen from him before. Not just assessment or approval, but something closer to wonder, like a man looking at his own house and barely recognizing it. Mara, he said, quiet. This is... He stopped, seeming to search for a word large enough to hold what he meant, and not finding one. This is something. Sit down and find out if it tastes as good as it looks, Mara said, though her voice carried a warmth she didn't bother to hide. He sat. She carved the bird herself, the way she'd learned years ago. Clean, confident strokes, the meat falling away tender and golden, each plate served with a care that made it clear this wasn't just supper. It was something offered, something given. The first bite silenced the table entirely. It wasn't dramatic, the way silence in a room could sometimes be loud with tension. This was different, a hush that came from genuine astonishment, the particular quiet of men encountering something they hadn't known to expect from their own lives. Tommy's eyes went wide. Daniel set down his fork for a moment just to sit with the taste of it. Even Frank, normally so reserved, let out a low sound of pure appreciation that made Pete laugh despite himself. I ain't had chicken like this since my mother was alive, Pete said finally, and there was no mockery in it now, no edge, nothing but plain honest admission. Not once, not in 20 years. Well, Mara said, eat up, there's plenty. But it was Caleb's reaction that held the whole room's attention, even if none of them said so directly. He ate slowly, deliberately, the way he did most things, but there was something in his face that none of the men had seen from him before. Not since his father died, maybe not ever, a kind of open, unguarded pleasure that he didn't bother hiding the way he usually hid everything. Caleb, Wes said eventually, grinning, you gonna say something or just sit there making faces at your plate? Caleb looked up, caught off guard, and for a moment something almost like embarrassment crossed his face before he set it aside. I'm saying, he said, slow and deliberate, looking directly at Mara now, that I've run this ranch 8 years, built it up from nothing after my father passed, worked it through droughts and bad winters and worse cooks than I care to remember, and I never once sat down to a meal in this house that made me feel like a man worth feeding. The table had gone very still again, but this silence was different from the one before, charged, attentive, every man at that table understanding they were watching something important happen, even if they couldn't have named exactly what. That's what you've given this ranch, Caleb continued. Not just food, not just a clean kitchen and a working smokehouse and apples put up for winter. You've given us a reason to come in from the cold and feel like we're coming home to something, instead of just stopping work because the sun went down. Mara stood very still by the stove, her hands folded in front of her apron, feeling the weight of every eye in the room turning toward her. But it was Caleb's eyes she held, steady and unflinching despite the heat rising in her chest, despite the years of comments and sideways glances and unfinished sentences that had taught her to brace herself against exactly this kind of attention. It's just chicken, Caleb, she said, though her voice wasn't quite as steady as she wanted it to be. It's not just chicken, Caleb said, and there was no hesitation in him now, none of the careful, measured distance he usually kept even in his kindest moments. It's proof that everything good that's happened on this ranch these past weeks has happened because of you. Not despite anything about you. Because of you. All of you. The room held its breath. Pete, who'd been the loudest voice against her that first week, who'd made comment after comment about her size before learning better, set down his fork and looked at her with something that might have been the closest thing to an apology he'd ever managed without words attached. He's right, Pete said, gruff, looking down at his plate rather than at her directly, the way men did when admitting something difficult. I said some ugly things when you first got here, judged you before I knew the first thing about you. That was wrong of me, and I knew it was wrong even while I was saying it, and I'm sorry for it. Mara felt something tighten in her throat, unexpected and sudden, the accumulated weight of years of similar judgments suddenly meeting, in this one moment, an actual reckoning instead of silence or avoidance. "Thank you, Pete," she said, quiet. "That means more than you probably know." "Means it," Pete said. "All of it." Wes, not to be outdone, cleared his throat. "Said some things too that first day. Was wrong about all of it. This is the best ranch I ever worked, and it ain't close." "Same," Daniel said, simple and direct. The most words Mara had heard from him at one sitting since she'd arrived. Tommy, grinning ear to ear, just said, "Best supper of my whole life," which made the table laugh, the tension breaking into something warmer, something that felt, to Mara, like watching a long winter finally crack toward spring, even though the snow outside hadn't melted an inch. Caleb didn't say anything more, not in front of the others, but later that night, after the table had been cleared and the men had scattered to their bunks full and quiet, in a way that felt different from every other night since she'd arrived, he lingered in the kitchen the way he'd started lingering, watching her finish her work with an expression she'd come to recognize and, if she was honest with herself, come to want. "You didn't have to say all that," Mara said, drying her hands on her apron, not quite able to meet his eyes directly. In front of the men. "Yes, I did," Caleb said. "Should have said it sooner. Should have said something the first week, when Pete and Wes were running their mouths and you were standing there taking it without complaint because you'd decided a long time ago that defending yourself wasn't worth the energy it cost. I let that happen too long before I stepped in." "You stepped in eventually," Mara said. "That's more than most men manage." "Eventually isn't good enough," Caleb said, and there was something rough in his voice now, something that sounded almost like regret. "You came into this house a stranger, married to a man you'd never met, and the first thing my hands did was judge you for your size instead of seeing what you actually were. And I let it happen for longer than I should have because I didn't know yet what you were going to become to this ranch. To me." Mara went very still at that, the kitchen suddenly feeling smaller around them, warmer, the lamplight catching something steady and unguarded in Caleb's face that she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful assessment of their first meeting, not the cautious warmth of the weeks since, but something closer to honesty laid bare. "What have I become to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb crossed the small distance between them, slow, deliberate, the way he did everything, and stopped close enough that she could see the lamplight reflected in his eyes. "Necessary," he said. "Not the way a cook is necessary, or a wife on paper is necessary, the way breathing is necessary. I didn't know that when you stepped off that wagon. I know it now." Mara's breath caught. The years of careful self-protection she'd built around herself since girlhood, suddenly feeling less like armor and more like a weight she'd been carrying far too long without setting down. "Caleb," she started, but he reached out, gentle, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face. The first time he'd touched her with anything beyond the brief, accidental contact of two people sharing a kitchen, and the words died in her throat. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Just wanted you to know it. Wanted you to hear it plain, the way I should have said it weeks ago, instead of letting my hands talk around you like you weren't worth the courtesy of an honest word." She looked up at him, the kitchen quiet around them except for the settling pop of the stove and the wind working at the windows outside, and felt, for the first time since stepping down off that wagon into a yard full of strangers who'd judged her before she'd said a single word, that she had finally arrived somewhere that wanted all of her, not despite what she carried, but because of every part of who she was. "Well," she said finally, her voice thick but steady, "for what it's worth, Caleb Rowan, I think you're becoming pretty necessary to me, too." He smiled then, real and unguarded, the kind of smile she hadn't seen from him before, not once in all the weeks since she'd arrived, and outside the snow kept falling soft and steady over the ranch, burying the yard in white, while inside the kitchen something had shifted permanently between them. Not loud, not dramatic, but solid and lasting in the way the best things on a working ranch always were, built slow and careful, the same way she'd rebuilt his kitchen from ruin, one honest effort at a time. December settled in hard over the ranch, the kind of cold that turned breath to fog and made even the short walk between the house and the barn feel like an expedition. But the household that weathered it now bore little resemblance to the one Mara had stepped into back in October. The kitchen ran like something built on purpose instead of patched together out of necessity. The smokehouse held enough cured meat to last well past the thaw. The root cellar, organized now by Mara's own careful hand, held potatoes and onions sorted by how long they'd keep, Apples preserved a half dozen different ways, jars of beans and preserves lined up like soldiers on shelves that hadn't held anything but dust a few months before. It was Caleb who first suggested, over coffee one frostbitten morning, that her influence ought to extend further than the kitchen walls. "You've got a head for organizing things," he said, watching her work through her notebook at the table, the pages now thick with lists and tallies and careful notes on what worked and what didn't. "More than just food. You think in seasons, in what's coming, not just what's needed today." "That's just good housekeeping," Mara said, not looking up from her ledger of preserves. "It's more than that," Caleb said. "I keep the cattle numbers, the grazing rotations, the money in and out. But I've been running this ranch reactive my whole life, patching problems as they come instead of planning ahead of them. You don't work that way. You're 3 steps ahead before the rest of us know there's a step to take." Mara set down her pencil, considering him. "You're asking me something, Caleb. Might as well just ask it." He almost smiled at that, the directness of her that he'd come to rely on more than he'd ever admit out loud. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to look over the supply side of things. Not just kitchen supplies, the whole operation. Feed stores, what we're paying Russell for goods we could maybe get cheaper elsewhere. Whether we're wasting money on things we don't need and going without things we do." "That's not cook's work," Mara said, though there was no real objection in her voice, more curiosity than resistance. "Wasn't asking you as a cook," Caleb said. "Asking you as someone whose judgment I've come to trust more than my own on certain things." The words settled between them with a weight that went beyond the practical matter at hand, and Mara felt the warmth of it spread through her chest the way it had been doing more and more often these past weeks, ever since that night in the kitchen when Caleb had stood close enough that she could see the lamplight in his eyes and told her, plain and unguarded, that she'd become necessary to him. "All right," she said. "Show me your books." What followed over the next several weeks was a kind of partnership Mara hadn't expected to find in a marriage built on practicality and a signed contract. Evenings spent at the kitchen table with Caleb's ledgers spread between them, working through numbers by lamplight long after the hands had gone to bed. She found waste where he hadn't thought to look for it. Feed bought at premium prices from Russell when a supplier 2 towns over offered the same quality for less. Supplies duplicated because nobody had kept a proper running inventory. Money spent reactively on emergency purchases that careful planning could have avoided entirely. "You're better at this than half the men I know who do it for a living," Caleb admitted one night, staring at the column of figures she'd reorganized into something that finally made sense at a glance. "I just think the way I cook," Mara said. "Plan ahead. Use what you've got before you go buy more. Don't let anything sit around going to waste. Numbers aren't so different from flour and lard when you think on it." "Never thought of it that way," Caleb said. "But I suppose you're right." It wasn't just the books that changed. Word of the ranch's transformation kept spreading through Harland the way news always did in a small place hungry for something to talk about. And by midwinter, it had reached the ears of people who mattered to Caleb's business in ways that went beyond casual gossip. A cattle buyer who dealt with Caleb for years remarked, on a visit to settle accounts, that the Rowan operation seemed sharper than he remembered, better organized, the hands looking healthier and steadier than ranch crews usually managed through a hard winter. "Don't know what you've changed," the buyer said, a weathered man named Garrett who'd been doing business in the territory longer than Caleb had been alive. "But whatever it is, keep doing it. Used to worry about your operation losing hands every winter to better-fed outfits. Don't worry about that anymore." Caleb, standing in the yard with his breath fogging in the cold, found himself smiling in a way that had become more natural to him these past months. "Wasn't me that changed it," he said. "That'd be my wife's doing." Garrett raised an eyebrow at that, something curious in his expression. "That's so. Might want to bring her to town sometime. Word's already getting around about the kitchen out here. Be good for business, letting people see what she's built." The comment stayed with Caleb longer than he expected, turning over in his mind through the rest of the day's work, and that evening, over supper, he brought it up to Mara directly. "Garrett thinks you ought to come to town with me sometime," he said. "Says word's getting around about what you've built out here. Thinks it'd be good for the ranch's reputation." Mara, ladling stew into bowls, paused for a moment, something cautious crossing her face. "Town hasn't exactly been kind to me before, Caleb. Folks have a way of looking at a woman my size and deciding everything about her before she's said a word." "I know," Caleb said, quiet. but I'll be standing right there when they try it." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing the offer, weighing the old familiar fear of strangers' eyes against the steady warmth of a man who'd proven, again and again these past months, that he meant what he said. "All right," she said finally, "I'll come." The trip into Harland a few days later tested that promise sooner than either of them expected. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business whether they wanted to or not, and Mara felt the weight of unfamiliar eyes the moment the wagon rolled down the main street. Shopkeepers pausing in their doorways, a cluster of women outside the dry goods store who didn't bother lowering their voices as much as they probably thought they did. "That her? The new Rowan wife? Heavens, she's a big one, isn't she? Wonder what Caleb Rowan was thinking, marrying that." Mara kept her chin level, her hands folded in her lap, the old practiced stillness she'd perfected over years of exactly this kind of treatment settling over her like a second coat. But Caleb, beside her on the wagon seat, had gone rigid in a way she recognized now. The same hard stillness he'd shown the day he'd ordered Pete outside to think over his words. He drew the wagon to a stop directly in front of the women, close enough that there was no pretending the conversation hadn't been heard. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth, all flat edges and barely restrained irritation. "Something you wanted to say to my wife directly, or were you planning to keep talking about her like she's not sitting right here?" The women froze, caught out, color rising in more than one face. The oldest of them, a sharp-featured woman Mara would later learn was the banker's wife, recovered first, drawing herself up with the particular indignation of someone used to getting away with cruelty dressed as concern. "We didn't mean anything by it, Caleb. Just surprised is all. Surprised you'd choose—" "Choose what?" Caleb said, cutting her off, his voice dropping lower, harder. "Choose a woman who took a kitchen that hadn't fed my men a decent meal in 2 years and turned it into the reason half my crew stays through the hard winters instead of leaving for better outfits. Choose a woman who keeps better books than I do, who's put up enough preserves to last us through spring, who's taught me more about running this ranch properly in 4 months than I figured out on my own in 8 years. That choice?" The women had no answer for that, standing in awkward silence on the boardwalk while half the street had clearly stopped to listen. "My wife's size," Caleb continued, "has got nothing to do with her worth, and anyone who can't see past it to the woman underneath isn't worth her time or mine. So you can keep talking if you want. Won't change a single fact of what she's built out at my ranch, and it sure won't change how I feel about her." He snapped the reins before any of them could find their voice, and the wagon rolled on down the street, leaving the women standing in stunned silence behind them. Mara sat very still beside him, her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't fully name. Gratitude, certainly, but something deeper than that, too. Something that felt dangerously close to the kind of love she'd given up expecting to find for herself. "You didn't have to do that," she said, once they'd put enough distance behind them that her voice came out steady. "Stop saying that," Caleb said, though there was no real heat in it, just the particular roughness that came over him when he meant something deeply and didn't quite know how to soften it. "I'm going to keep doing it, Mara, every time, so you might as well get used to hearing it." She reached over without quite deciding to, and laid her hand over his on the reins, and he glanced at her, surprised, before something in his face settled into the same quiet contentment she'd come to recognize as belonging only to her. "All right," she said. "I'll get used to it." Say, the rest of that winter passed in a steady accumulation of small victories that Mara, looking back later, would understand as the slow architecture of a life finally built right. The supply changes she and Caleb had worked out together saved the ranch a meaningful sum by the time the books closed out the season. Money Caleb put toward new fencing and a second smokehouse Mara had suggested they'd need once they expanded the hog herd come spring. The hands, once skeptical strangers eyeing her with open doubt, had become something closer to family. Tommy in particular attaching himself to her with the easy devotion of a boy who'd found, in her, something like the mother he'd lost young. While even Pete, gruff as ever, had taken to bringing her wildflowers he found along the creek bed once the thaw started. Gestures of apology that had long since become unnecessary, but that he offered anyway, like a man making sure a debt stayed properly paid. It was in late February, with the worst of the winter finally breaking and the first hints of green starting to show through the snow along the fence lines, that Caleb found Mara out by the smokehouse, checking the last of the winter's cured meat, and stood watching her for a long moment before she noticed him. You're staring, she said without turning around. I am, Caleb agreed, unashamed. Got a lot worth staring at. She turned to face him then, something warm and unguarded in her expression that had become easier to wear with each passing month, the old defensive stillness softening more and more as winter wore on, and proved day after day that this particular home wasn't going to ask her to shrink herself to fit inside it. You're getting sentimental, Caleb Rowan, she said. Maybe I am, he said. Don't see the harm in it anymore. Not since you got here. He crossed the distance between them and took her hands in his, rough and weathered against her own. The hands of two people who'd built something real out of nothing but stubbornness and hard work, and a willingness to see each other clearly from the very start, even when the world around them hadn't managed the same courtesy. Spring's coming, he said. Ranch is in better shape than it's ever been. Men are steady, books are clean. None of that happens without you. We did it together, Mara said. We did, Caleb agreed. But it started with you. Started the day you stepped off that wagon and decided you weren't going to let anybody's small thinking decide what you were worth out here. Mara felt her throat tighten, the accumulated weight of years of being underestimated finally settling, here in this cold yard with the smell of cured meat and wood smoke around them, into something like peace. I didn't know what I was walking into that first day, she admitted. Didn't know if I'd find anything here worth staying for. And now? Caleb asked, quiet, something vulnerable in the question that he rarely allowed himself to show. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else, Mara said, simple and certain. This is home, Caleb. Your home. He pulled her closer then, and for a long moment they stood together in the thinning winter light. The ranch spread out around them, transformed by months of careful, patient work into something neither of them had quite dared imagine back in October. Not a place of mere survival, but a place built deliberately, brick by brick, meal by meal, on the kind of trust that didn't need loud declarations to prove itself real. The snow kept melting at the fence lines, and somewhere out past the barn, the first cattle of the season had already begun shifting restlessly, sensing the change coming the way animals always did before people caught up to it. Spring was coming to Harlan, Montana, and with it, the full flowering of everything Mara Delaney had built since the day a wagon had carried her, alone and unsure but never once ashamed, up that long, dusty drive toward a life she hadn't known yet was waiting for her. True spring arrived in Harlan the way it always did in that country, reluctant and then all at once, like mud first, then green poking stubborn through the brown, then one morning the whole valley smelling like wet earth and new growth instead of wood smoke and frozen ground. The ranch that emerged from that winter looked, to anyone who hadn't watched it happen day by day, like an entirely different operation than the one Mara had walked into back in October. The hen house ran at full capacity now, eggs enough to sell a portion into town. The garden plot behind the kitchen, turned and planted in the season's first warm week, promised vegetables enough to can through the coming year without relying so heavily on the mercantile. The smokehouse Caleb had built a second of stood ready for the next hog slaughter. And the books, Mara's books now as much as his, showed a ranch operating in the black with room to spare, the kind of margin that meant choices instead of just survival. It was in the middle of this transformed spring that the land commissioner came through Harlan on his regular circuit. A stiff, careful man named Alistair Vance, who handled territorial business for half the county and had a reputation for noticing things other men missed. He arrived at the Rowan Ranch on a bright April afternoon to review boundary records and grazing permits, business that should have taken an hour and instead stretched into most of the day once he started looking around at what the ranch had become. I'll be honest with you, Rowan, Vance said, standing in the yard with his ledger tucked under one arm, looking out over corrals that had been mended, a barn with a roof finally patched proper, hands moving through their work with the kind of steady purpose that came from men who weren't exhausted past caring. Last time I came through here, must be 3 years back now, this place was barely holding together. Fences down in 2 spots, cattle looking thin for the season. Crew that looked like they were one bad winter from quitting on you entirely. Things have changed, Caleb said simply. I can see that. What I can't quite work out is how. Vance glanced toward the house, where smoke curled steady from the chimney and the smell of baking bread drifted faint across the yard. Heard talk in town. About your wife. About the kitchen. Caleb didn't hesitate, didn't soften it the way some men might have, embarrassed to credit a woman so plainly for what outsiders still expected a rancher to claim as his own doing. "It's her," he said. "All of it. The kitchen, the stores, half the planning that's kept this operation running smarter instead of just harder. I built the bones of this ranch. She's the reason it's actually thriving instead of barely surviving." Vance raised an eyebrow, the particular skepticism of a man used to ranchers overselling their own operations. "That's a generous claim for a man to make about his wife's cooking." "It's not about the cooking," Caleb said, "though that's good too. It's about everything she touches. You want to understand why this ranch looks different than it did 3 years back. Go inside, talk to her yourself. She'll tell you plainer than I can." Vance did exactly that. And what he found in the kitchen, Mara elbow-deep in dough, the room organized with the same careful efficiency that had transformed every corner of the ranch she'd touched, left him quieter than he'd been in the yard, the particular quiet of a man revising assumptions he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Mrs. Rowan," he said, "your husband credits you with turning this whole operation around." "My husband's generous," Mara said, not pausing in her work. "But it wasn't just me. Takes a whole crew working together to keep a ranch running right. I just made sure nobody was doing it hungry or unprepared." "Modest," Vance observed. "Honest," Mara corrected, echoing words she'd said to Caleb months before, back when the kitchen had still smelled of neglect instead of bread. "I don't need credit for doing the work I came here to do. I just needed the chance to do it properly." Vance left that afternoon with his ledger updated and something else besides, an observation he'd carry with him on the rest of his circuit through the territory. That the difference between a struggling operation and a thriving one sometimes came down to nothing more complicated than someone finally being given the room to do their work well, and someone else being wise enough to recognize the value in that and get out of the way. That evening, after Vance's wagon had disappeared down the long drive and the hands had finished their supper and scattered to enjoy the rare warm evening, Mara found herself out on the porch with Caleb, the two of them sitting in the kind of comfortable silence that had become their habit these past months, watching the sun go down gold and slow over pasture that stretched green and healthy toward the horizon. "You didn't have to tell him all that," Mara said. "About me. Could have just let him think it was your doing." "Could have," Caleb agreed. "Wouldn't have been true, though. And I'm done letting people believe things that aren't true, especially about you." Mara smiled, settling deeper into the porch chair beside him, feeling the particular ease of a body finally allowed to take up its space without apology, without bracing for judgment that never came anymore. Not from him, not from the hands, not even these days from most of the town that had learned, slowly and sometimes grudgingly, to measure her by what she'd built instead of by what she looked like building it. "Funny thing," she said, after a while. "I spent most of my life believing I had to make myself smaller to be welcome anywhere, quieter, more agreeable, less visible. Took me coming all the way out here, marrying a stranger sight unseen, to finally understand that wasn't true. Never was true. I just hadn't found the place yet that was willing to see me clear." Caleb reached over and took her hand, the same rough, weathered grip that had peeled apples beside her that first careful afternoon, that had pulled her close in the yard by the smokehouse, that had steadied her through every hard moment since. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think the world's full of folks who never bother looking past the first thing they see. Doesn't mean there's nothing worth seeing underneath. Just means most people aren't patient enough or brave enough to look." "That's a fine way of putting it," Mara said. "Learned it from you," Caleb said. "You taught me patience, same as you taught Pete to peel an apple right. Didn't think I had it in me before you got here. Turns out I just hadn't had a reason yet." They sat together as the light faded, the ranch settling into evening around them, cattle lowing soft in the distance, the hands' voices drifting faint from the bunkhouse, the whole operation breathing easy in a way it hadn't when Mara first arrived, exhausted and uncertain, and trying to survive on patched-together meals and a kitchen nobody had cared enough to fix. "I used to think," Mara said quietly, "that being useful was the only way I'd ever earn my place anywhere, that I had to work twice as hard, prove twice as much, just to balance out whatever folks decided about me before I'd said a single word. Took me a long while to understand the difference between being valued for what you do and being valued, period, just for being who you are." "You're both, to me," Caleb said. "Always have been, since that first day. Just took me longer than it should have, to say it plain." Mara turned to look at him, the last of the evening light catching gold in his eyes, and felt the particular fullness of a life that had finally arrived somewhere worth staying. Not because she'd shrunk herself to fit it, but because she'd built it, brick by brick and meal by meal, exactly the way she was. The ranch held its rhythm through that spring and into summer, steady and sure in a way that no longer surprised anyone who'd watched it happen. Tommy, grown another inch and considerably more confident than the boy who'd hovered nervously in the kitchen doorway that first October day, had taken to helping Mara in the garden in whatever spare hours he could find, the two of them developing an easy, comfortable rapport that Mara suspected would last long past his years working for Caleb. Pete had stopped bringing apologetic wildflowers, not because the gesture had worn thin, but because the apology itself had become unnecessary, replaced by an easy respect that needed no further proving. Wes had taken to bragging about the ranch's food to other hands he met in town. The same loud mouth that had once mocked her now turned entirely in her favor, which struck Mara, when she thought about it, as a fitting kind of justice, not punishment, just the natural correction of a man who'd learned better and wasn't shy about saying so. It was on a warm evening in early June, nearly 8 months after that first cold wagon ride up the long dusty drive, that Mara stood in the kitchen, her kitchen now, in every sense that mattered, kneading bread dough while the smell of it mixed with herbs drying along the rafters and the low murmur of the hands' voices drifted in from the porch where they'd gathered after supper, easy and unhurried the way men only gathered when they trusted the place they'd landed. Caleb came in quiet, the way he often did these days, and stood for a moment in the doorway just watching her work, the same way he had that very first evening when she'd been streaked gray with soot and exhausted from clearing a stove nobody had bothered fixing in years. "You're staring again," Mara said, without turning. "Can't seem to help it," Caleb said, crossing the kitchen to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even without looking up from her work. 8 months ago, I stood right here and watched a stranger walk into the worst kitchen on this ranch and decide, without anybody asking her to, that she was going to fix it anyway. Didn't know then what that was going to mean. For the ranch. For me. And now? Mara asked, echoing the question he'd asked her months before, out by the smokehouse with the smell of cured meat and the first hints of thaw in the air. "Now I know," Caleb said, simple and certain, the way he said most things that mattered to him. "Now I know exactly what it meant. It meant everything." Mara set down the dough, wiped her hands on her apron, and turned to face him fully, the kitchen warm and golden around them in the lamplight, bread rising under its cloth, herbs drying overhead, every shelf and surface bearing the mark of months of careful, patient work that had transformed a place of mere survival into something worth calling home. "I think about that first day sometimes," she said. "How scared I was, even though I didn't let it show. How certain I was that I'd find here exactly what I'd found everywhere else, people deciding what I was worth before I'd had the chance to show them. And instead I found this," Caleb finished, gesturing not just to the kitchen, but to all of it, the ranch beyond the walls, the life they'd built together out of practicality that had grown, slow and unhurried, into something neither of them had dared name at first, but both understood now, plain and certain, as love. "This," Mara agreed. Outside, the last light of the long June evening was fading gentle over pasture and fence line, over a ranch that no longer ran on improvisation and survival, but on the deliberate, careful planning of a woman who'd refused, from her very first step off that wagon, to let anyone else's small thinking decide her worth. The hands' voices carried easy from the porch, laughter mixed in now where there'd once been only tired silence. The cattle settled for the night in pasture that stretched healthy and green as far as the eye could carry. And in the kitchen that had once been nothing but a ruin nobody cared enough to fix, Mara Delaney stood beside the man who'd learned, slowly and then completely, to see her exactly as she was, not despite anything, but because of everything, and understood, with the same calm certainty she'd carried into that kitchen 8 months before, that she had finally found the place she was always meant to stand. Nothing more needed saying that night. No grand announcement, no declaration beyond what had already been lived, day after day, meal after meal, in the steady accumulation of small, honest efforts that built something real far better than any single grand gesture ever could. The bread rose slow under its cloth, the lamp burned low and warm, and the ranch, transformed from ruin into something thriving, held everything it had become. quietly, completely, and for good.